Welcome back. Now, right near the end of the course, we come to the book of Revelation, and we're going to have some fun with this one today. Revelation is one of those books which Christians don't really know what to do with. I'm not sure if you've read it recently, but I think most Christians, when they read it, generally scratch their head and consider it to be a rather mysterious book. Alternatively, there are large sections within the Christian church today who think they've got the book of Revelation nailed. And the reason they think that is because of how they approach the book of Revelation. Probably the most prevalent or predominant way of reading Revelation is to think that Revelation, by and large, is talking about the future. In fact, the standard way of reading Revelation across much of at least the Protestant church is to think that Revelation, especially from chapters 5 onwards, is describing those years immediately prior to the return of Jesus, periods of great tribulation and of rapture and of a millennial kingdom prior to the return of Jesus. All of those ways of reading Revelation are thinking that Revelation is a work of prophecy that is predicting the distant future, that time immediately prior to the return of Jesus. However, Revelation is one of those books where how you read it really drives the meaning that you derive from it. So the way that we're going to approach Revelation today is to give you sort of the consensus way of reading the book of Revelation amongst those biblical scholars who have made their specialization the reading of Revelation in its historical context and as a form of ancient religious writings. When we take the findings of that body of scholarship into account, it's going to radically change the way that we might read Revelation. What we'll discover then is that Revelation is probably best not read as talking about the future. Now, I know that might come as a bit of a surprise or a shock or maybe even unsettling to you, but I'd like you to bear this thought in mind. How is it that the book of Revelation ended up in the Christian canon at all? Presumably it got put into the Christian canon, into the New Testament, because the people to whom it was first read perceived that God was speaking to them in a meaningful, relevant, and powerful way. That they heard the voice of God speaking to them in their context. In other words, I'm going to encourage us that we should be reading Revelation with an eye to what is it that the original audience, the historical audience of the 7 churches in Asia Minor in the first century, how would they have understood what Revelation was trying to tell them? But let me give you a few other reasons why I think we should be reading Revelation not futuristically, but through the eyes of the historical audience. I'd like you to imagine, firstly, that Revelation should be read futuristically. Imagine the Revelation is talking about those years immediately prior to the return of Jesus. That means that the book of Revelation must be talking about events at least 2,000 years after the lives of those people who first read it. My question is, how would that first audience have ever made any sense of and derived any value from reading about events that were 2,000 years in the future? How would they have been able to even make sense of what they were reading? That would be the first thing I'd like you to think about. The second thing I think is worth reflecting on is every generation that has read Revelation as talking about the future understood themselves to be living in those final years prior to the return of Jesus. And their standard approach was to read the book of Revelation and see if they could identify events happening in the world around them so they could go, those events are being predicted in the book of Revelation itself. Aha, we're living in the end times. The problem with that is that Revelation has only been read that way relatively recently, probably for the last 150 years. That's probably 5 to 6 different generations, or possibly a few more. But every generation that has read Revelation that way has obviously been wrong. In other words, when they looked at Revelation and looked at the events happening around them and concluded that they were living in the end times, It obviously turned out that they weren't living in the end times because Jesus did not return in their generation. That surely should lead us to conclude that that way of reading Revelation is fraught with danger. Another reason why I'd encourage you not to think about it as pointing to the future is, based on that, when would you know that you are the generation about whom this book is referring? How would you know that the events that you see in the world around you are indeed the ones that are being talked about in the book of Revelation quite accurately? The only way that you'll know that you are the final generation is when Jesus actually returns. And quite frankly, when that happens, you don't need the book of Revelation anymore because you've got Jesus and his everlasting kingdom. So I think there are problems, deep problems, with reading the book of Revelation futuristically. I think it therefore makes much better sense, and I'm certainly not alone with this, and I'm just giving you the consensus of scholarship on how to read Revelation. I think Revelation makes so much more sense when we think about how does it make sense to its original audience there in the first century, in those 7 churches which are listed in the first 3 chapters, those 7 churches in Western Asia Minor, dealing with the issues that they are dealing with in the first century. That's the way I think we should approach it. We should be asking ourselves, what's going on in their lives? What's the author trying to say to them? What might God be trying to say through the author to that audience to help them deal with their circumstances? We'd also want to approach reading Revelation with a sensitivity to genre. You would remember that when we've been dealing with the letters, one of the things that we've emphasized is that you need to read the New Testament letters like letters. And because the rules that come with reading letters give us the rules by which we should interpret them. Similarly, when we come to Revelation, we want to ask, what genre of literature is this, and how can we read it well? And so lastly then, when we come to reading Revelation, when we put the audience and the genre together, one of the other things we have to bring with that is what's going on in the context? What's going on in the lives of these 7 churches? What's going on in the world around them that creates the context within which they are having to live their Christian lives? Because those will give us the clues that we need to make sense of what we find in what is actually a deeply mysterious and hard to read book. So let's spend a bit of time talking about genre. How do we go about reading the book of Revelation? What genre is it? Well, just to complicate matters, I'm going to suggest to you today that the book of Revelation is in fact 3 genres. The first genre is probably the most straightforward. Revelation is, first of all, a letter. It includes 7 letters to 7 churches, and in its opening and in its closing, it bears some of the hallmarks we've come to realise are fairly standard in first century letters, especially first century Christian letters. So what we learn by considering the genre of Revelation as a letter is that letters in the first century are occasioned by and large. That means that they are triggered or stimulated by a context, by a set of events going on in the life of the author or in the lives of the audience. And because of what's going on in that context, a letter is written to address the issues that are confronting them. So we'd want to ask, what are the issues that are confronting these 7 churches that triggers this letter, this prophetic, strange letter to be written to them? But it deeply connects us with what's going on in the historical context. The second genre of literature that Revelation is that it is prophecy. We know that because it identifies itself in a couple of places as being a work of prophecy. Now, at this point, this is where we can start leaning towards a futuristic reading of Revelation, because in our common way of thinking, we think that prophecy is about telling the future. But in biblical terms, that's not what prophecy primarily is about. Especially when you go back to the Old Testament, but also in some parts of the New Testament, we see a rather different picture of prophecy. Prophecy is not so much predicting the future, but speaking for God. when you read the Old Testament prophets, what you discover is the prophet says things like, "Thus says the Lord," or "This is what God has got to say." And what he's communicating is Israel is going about their lives, and in often cases it's a life of disobedience and idolatry, and the prophet speaks on God's behalf into that situation saying, "This is what God has got to say." He sees how you're living. He sees your disobedience and your idolatry. This is what he has got to say about your disobedience and idolatry. And he urges you, indeed commands you, to repent from your behavior and come back to the ways that covenant life as God's peoples dictates to you how you should live. If you do that, then favor and blessing will come your way. But if you don't do that, then you should expect destruction and punishment to come your way. So when the Old Testament prophets talk about the future, they're only talking about the future in order to get a change to occur in the present. They speak on God's behalf to God's people, saying, "This is what God sees, this is what God says, this is what God wants you to do. If you do it, this is what's going to happen. If you don't do it, this is what's going to happen." Therefore, when we come to the book of Revelation, we should consider that it too is a work of prophecy. Namely, that what John is seeking to do is to speak as a prophet to these 7 congregations, to say, God sees you. This is what God has got to say about how you are living in your circumstances. These are the actions, this is the changes, these are the ways that God would have you to live based on what he sees and what he says about how you're living. In that sense, it is truly prophecy like we encounter in the rest of the Bible. It is not necessarily talking about the future at all, and it doesn't need to talk about the future to be a genuine work of prophecy. The third genre of literature that Revelation is, and this is possibly the most evident form of literature that we find in Revelation, but also the most difficult to come to terms with, and this is a subcategory of ancient religious literature known as apocalyptic. Now, a few things to say in background to apocalyptic literature. When we encounter the book of Revelation, it's probably the only book of its kind that you or I are ever likely to read. So we think that Revelation is this unique and uniquely strange piece of literature. But what those who study apocalyptic literature have discovered is that in the intertestamental period and around the time of Jesus and into the 1st century when Revelation itself was written, apocalyptic literature was a quite common form of Jewish religious writing. That means that it's quite likely then that members of John's audience understood how this form of literature worked and understood how to decode its references to the real world around them. So it was a form of literature that Jewish writers in particular were used to writing and audiences were used to reading. Another feature, though, of apocalyptic literature is it's not just a style of literature, it also describes a theological outlook on the world and in particular the way that God was working in the world. Apocalyptic ways of thinking were looking for God to step dramatically into world affairs, to deliver God's people from their evil and persecuting overlords, to deliver them into freedom, to deliver them into salvation, and for God to bring his eschatological kingdom to this world. So apocalyptic literature, written by apocalypticists, are looking at the world and God's actions in the world in that kind of way. And so in that sense, Revelation is a work of apocalypse, of apocalyptic literature, in that it is looking for God to step into the lives of God's people in the 1st century and deliver them from their persecutors, to deliver them from evil and to liberate them into the freedom of God's eschatological kingdom. Having said that, there are some common features that you find across apocalyptic literature that we need to go through, and as those features which we need to try and interpret. Firstly, as you probably already worked out, apocalyptic literature is a form of literature that is typically written during times of persecution. It's in times of persecution when God's people's eyes turn away from some of the good times they're experiencing and start thinking about things like, God, What are you going to do about this suffering that we as your people are experiencing? When are you going to step into our story and deliver us from this evil? When are you going to set us free from our oppressors? And so therefore, in times of persecution, God's people's eyes start turning towards topics of judgment and salvation. In particular, they don't just think about their own salvation. Instead, they recognize the fact that as God's people, they are experiencing yet another installment of what God's people have periodically always experienced, namely opposition from the enemies of God. And so when God's people find themselves in a time of persecution again, their minds don't just focus on their own salvation, but asks the larger question, God, when are you going to step not just into our story, but into the human story and deliver humanity and your creation from evil? When are you going to set us all free from those evil forces which are controlling this world and bringing your faithful people into suffering and hardship? So it looks to the end of history and the arrival of God's plan to this world to sum all things up in one great climactic event. A third feature of apocalyptic literature is that it involves visions and dreams. And we'll certainly find this going on in Revelation. We find the author being taken up into heaven and having a vision of Jesus and having a vision of the heavenly throne room and seeing described to him these climactic and cataclysmic events as they are poured out upon the world. So it involves visions and dreams. When the author has those visions and dreams, though, one thing that is really interesting about them is that the images that they see are otherworldly. They are not typically the images of things that you find in this world. When you read the Old Testament prophets, for example, you'll see images used like walls or bricks or towers or those kinds of everyday items being turned to prophetic symbolic use. But when you read apocalyptic literature, the images that you see there are otherworldly. You see heaven, you see strange beasts, you see dragons, you see angels, you might see demonic forces. These are images of another world. And they're also highly crafted works of literature and often have repetitive patterns which form some kind of structuring device. And then when you come to the book of Revelation, we have sequences of the number 7. We have 7 seals and 7 bowls and 7 trumpets. The number 7 is used a lot as an organizing device. And it's in this kind of highly crafted way that the story of Revelation proceeds. The question we'd want to ask with apocalyptic literature and those kinds of features is, why would somebody write in that style? What's going on? And this is the conclusion that scholars of apocalyptic literature have come to, is that what's going on with an apocalypse is that the author is presenting heaven's point of view. And this is why we find that it takes place in visions and dreams, and why the imagery that it uses is otherworldly, because it's creating the impression in the audience's mind that the author is not just describing things around them, but instead they've gone up to heaven and they're seeing things from heaven's perspective. That is why there is a vision, or they are taken off to heaven. And when you go off to heaven, you enter into another world and you look behind the physical fabric of our ordinary world and you see the spiritual realities that are behind everyday life. When you see those spiritual realities, when you see things how they really are, you certainly wouldn't expect them to look like what you see on a day-by-day basis. So the otherworldly imagery is there intentionally to create this sense that we have entered into another realm. We've entered into God's realm. We are seeing things from heaven's perspective. We have gone to God's throne room. We are looking down on earth and seeing things how He sees them. And we see this kind of idea, for example, in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, where after the letters to the 7 churches, the text changes, and we see John say, "After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." So, first thing apocalyptic literature is providing heaven's perspective. That also means that the writer is able to reinforce their credentials as a prophet, because they are truly providing heaven's perspective to God's people. It's another form of "thus says the Lord." A second feature of apocalyptic literature, and this is where we derive its name from, is that apocalyptic literature is an apocalypsis. And by apocalypsis, what is meant is, by that Greek term, is an unveiling of what was previously hidden. Indeed, a revelation. And so even the book of Revelation opens up with the revelation or the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ, which was given to his servant John. So Revelation describes itself as an unveiling, an apocalypsis. It is firstly an apocalypsis or a revelation of Jesus, but it is also a revelation of God's view of what is going on earth around the lives of those first century believers. If you will, it's being in a revelation, it pulls back the curtain of space and time so that the audience can see things as they really are. What do I mean by pulling back the curtain of space and time? Well, what I mean is that when you're down on earth, you're locked into seeing things as they are in this physical world. But when you go up to heaven, if you will, the curtain is pulled back on our physical reality, and we see things from a different vantage point. We see the spiritual realities. We see our perspective is altered, and the curtain is pulled back on space. We see different creatures and different beings and different powers and different structures. So we get a fuller picture of reality. But I also said that in an apocalypse, the curtain is pulled back on time itself. What I mean by that is, when you're down on earth, you can only see what is right in front of you, what is going on around you right now. But when you go up to heaven and the curtain is pulled back, what you see is not just the spiritual realities, but you see the full sweep of human history. You see the full sweep of time. And you get to see the beginning from the end, and you get to see God's purposes working their way out through human history. What that means then is you get to see what's going on in your time and space within the global sweep of God's plans for all of the ages. So by that, when you get to see things from a new spatial point of view and from a new temporal point of view, your perspective on your experience changes radically. Another feature of apocalyptic literature, and why this form of literature is used, is because of the dramatic involvement it creates for the audience. Now, you've read the letters of the New Testament. My guess is that when you're reading those letters, you don't have images and pictures flow through your minds. It doesn't become an imaginative experience for you. However, when you read the book of Revelation, I guess you probably have, like I do, a completely opposite experience to that. You find yourself imagining heaven. You find yourself imagining the throne room of God, imagining the strange mystical beasts that John sees while he's up there. You imagine angels. You imagine plagues being thrown down onto earth. You imagine the events that are being narrated in the book. What's going on there? Well, if God is trying to speak through a prophet to his audience, he wants to have the biggest impact in their lives that he possibly can, which means, yes, he might want to reach them intellectually, but he also wants to reach them imaginatively. He wants to reach them emotionally. He wants to reach them spiritually. And what apocalyptic literature allows you to do is to engage the whole person. You engage their intellect because there's a message here. You engage their imagination that fires their imagination to see those events and those peoples and those persons and heaven and the throne room. That becomes a vivid picture that stays with them. But also, as the story of Revelation unfolds, as the drama is narrated, the audience gets brought into this unfolding story. And as the drama goes along, they become emotionally engaged with the highs and the lows and the tension and the pain and the exaltation and the glory and the peace and the wonder and the awe. And that leaves a deep emotional impact and residue in their lives, so that after they've had the experience of revelation being read out to them, it leaves them with this deep impact in their lives, where they've received an intellectual message, where they have had their imagination fired, where their emotions have been deeply stirred, and that sets them up with this heightened impact to then live the kind of lives that God prophetically is speaking to them about. So that's what's going on with the genre of Revelation. So having done genre, I think we now need to spend some time talking about context. When we come to exploring the context of Revelation, the best place for us to go is to look at the 7 letters to the 7 churches that make up the first 3 chapters, because those are letters written to specific churches in specific locations and are addressing specific issues that the audience are dealing in each of those places. If you're familiar with them, you remember that Revelation is written to the 7 churches of Smyrna, Ephesus, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Thyatira, and Pergamum. And what I'd encourage you to do at one point is to read those 7 letters and see if you can discern for yourself what's going on in the context. But here are some things that we can draw, some conclusions we can draw about the context. As we talked about in our lecture on the general epistles, especially when we talked about 1 Peter, we talked about the rise of the imperial cult. And what ancient history tells us is that the region of Asia Minor, where our 7 churches are located, was one of those regions where the imperial cult was the strongest. Now, the imperial cult is not something that was imposed by the emperors themselves. Rather, it was something that came from the provinces up towards Rome. The provinces recognized that if they could attract the attention of the Roman emperor and his family, that would mean perhaps that the emperor would lean towards them with favor and give them, through the use of his power and his wealth and influence, access to prosperity, to protection, to peace, to advantage. So therefore they would compete with one another, as it were, and outdo each other to try and attract the attention of the emperor by presenting themselves as the most loyal and the most honouring cities or regions within his empire. Consequently then, it was expected by all members of those cities that at some point during the year that all citizens would engage in the worship of or honouring of the emperor through sacrifice and by making the proclamation that Caesar is Lord. Of course, the early Christians, as we've already discussed, are not in a position to make that proclamation because they believe by contrast that Jesus is Lord and that Caesar is in fact a pretender to global domination. That's the God of Israel. It is his Messiah, Jesus Christ, who is the true King, the one to whom allegiance is truly warranted. And so they are going to pronounce Jesus as Lord and not Caesar. That is going to put them at odds with their surrounding communities, who are going to put pressure upon them to come back to the fold we discussed last time. One of the ways in particular that their surrounding community is going to put pressure upon the early Christians is by ostracizing them from the economic life of the empire. Most people in the ancient world lived around the poverty line and lived from day to day through day labouring or from being market stall holders in the local market or tradesmen or artisans. And therefore they relied upon as big a clientele as they could muster to make their ends meet and to make their way in the world economically. One of the ways then that a society could put pressure upon Christians is by refusing to hire them as day labourers, or refusing to buy from their market stalls, or refusing to buy the goods that they would make in their trade guilds. And so as a result of that kind of economic ostracism and isolation, Christians would find themselves falling deeper and deeper into poverty. And so they would be confronted with the question, is this really worthwhile? As I follow Jesus, who is supposedly the king and the ruler of the universe, who's going to save and deliver and bless us, as I follow him, I find myself becoming poorer and poorer and poorer. And life becomes harder and more difficult, and I find myself on the fringe, on the edges of my society. Is it really worth it? And so therefore you can imagine that the early churches are having to deal with, is it really worth giving their allegiance to Christ when it would be so much easier to perhaps also give their allegiance to the emperor? Life would become a whole lot easier for them. So then when we read the letters to the 7 churches, we find evidence of this kind of persecution and ostracism. For example, in the letter to the church at Ephesus, it reads in chapter 2, verse 3, says, "You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name." Or to the church in Smyrna, it says in chapter 2, verse 10, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer." And then to the church in Pergamum, in chapter 2, verse 13, it says, "You did not renounce your faith even in the days of Antipas, who was put to death." There's evidence of persecution and suffering in the life of these 7 churches. So there's evidence of persecution, but we also find evidence of the poverty and ostracism that we were talking about before, and also the temptation to compromise, that perhaps it's possible or allowable to both have Jesus as Lord and also to publicly acknowledge Caesar as Lord, to engage in the worship of Jesus and also the worship and honouring of the emperor. So for example, in chapter 3, verses 15 to 17, in the letter to the Laodiceans, Jesus through John says to that church, he says, "I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. You are lukewarm. You say, 'I am rich, I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing.' But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked." When they say we are rich and have acquired wealth, I wonder how they acquired that wealth. Perhaps they acquired that wealth through compromise. Maybe that's the reason why Jesus says to them, "You are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked." Your material prosperity is countered by a spiritual poverty. By contrast, it says to the church in Smyrna in chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich." To the churches in Sardis, by contrast, it says, "You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead," in chapter 3, verse 1. And to the church in Ephesus, it says, "You have forsaken your first love." So what we see there in some of the churches is a determination to be loyal to Jesus, and even though that will result in hardship and poverty, they're going to stay loyal, and that equates to true riches. But other churches have been tempted to compromise. They have gone lukewarm in their faith. They were alive, but their faith has become dead. They have forsaken their first love, their allegiance to Jesus, and have now included other things that are competing for their allegiance as well. So that is another dimension of what's going on in the lives of these 7 churches. One of the things that complicates these for these 7 churches is the existence of false teachers or teachers of compromise or false prophets. For example, we read in the church in Pergamum, chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and committing sexual immorality." So what John is alluding to there is that the church in Pergamum has these false prophets like the prophet Balaam. Now you may recall Balaam as being that guy who was contracted to curse Israel as they were coming out of the wilderness, who said, "I can't curse those whom God has blessed." But the postscript of Balaam's life is that he came up with another strategy to suit those people who had hired him. He said, "Here's how you can get Israel to be compromised. Here's how you can defeat them. Get them to worship your gods. Entice them to marry your women and engage in your idolatry, and then their God will desert them." And so it seems like this false prophet in Pergamum is encouraging the Christians to do essentially the same thing, to engage in the worship of the emperor. What do we make then, where he says about eating food sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality? Perhaps it's a reference to the fact that when a trade guild might meet, or when you're sort of sealing a new business deal, one of the things you might do is go up to the temple and have a sacred meal together. And what often happened then, so you'll be eating food sacrificed to idols in that case. And what is often the case in a pagan banquet of that time is that after the food and the drink, there would be entertainment of all forms, including sexual entertainment with sleeping with prostitutes and those kinds of things. So perhaps this is what these false prophets are enticing the church in Pergamum to get involved in. It is a way of compromising, of getting up close and personal to the surrounding society, getting to think that you're a pagan like they are, whilst keeping your Christian faith secret. As another example to the church in Thyatira, it says in chapter 2, verse 20, "I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols." Again, this prophetess at the church in Thyatira is referred to by the name Jezebel. That obviously makes us think of that story in the life of ancient Israel, where King Ahab and his Phoenician wife Jezebel led Israel astray into the worship of idols. And John is specifically pointing out a prophetess in Thyatira and describing her as another Jezebel. And these false prophets seem to be advocating compromise. Perhaps their message is, God doesn't mind if you engage in a bit of idol worship, a bit of paganism, a bit of food sacrifice to idols, a bit of sexual immorality. You're just working out ways of getting on with your lives, of feeding yourselves and your families. You've got to eat, you've got to survive, You don't need to be quite so hardcore. You don't need to be so exclusive in your allegiance to Jesus against all others. And that message of compromise is what John seems to specifically be targeting here. Another dimension of the context that we discover by reading these 7 letters is conflict with Jewish synagogues. For example, in the letter to the church in Smyrna in chapter 2, verse 9, he says, "I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." Or to the church in Philadelphia in chapter 3, verse 9, he says, "I will make those who are a synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not." So here we see growing conflict, not just with the pagans, but also with the Jewish community. And so the early Christians are finding themselves definitely caught between a rock and a hard place. Their pagan neighbors hate them. The Jews hate them. They are truly isolated from society. So they are faced with a dilemma. Do we continue with our fervent and exclusive allegiance to Jesus, or do we compromise with the paganism around us? Do we engage in the imperial cult specifically? Do we honor and worship the emperor as well and engage in his cult just so that we can survive? And it seems into that kind of context, those issues that these 7 churches are dealing with, that John is writing his prophetic apocalyptic letter to bring a message from God to them which will empower them to remain loyal to Jesus, regardless of the price, to give them the spiritual, intellectual and emotional fuel to keep moving forward and persisting during persecution, through poverty, through ostracism, to remain loyal and faithful all the way through to the coming of Christ's eschatological kingdom. So what is the author's purpose? What is he trying to achieve? Well, there's several things that he's trying to achieve. The first thing is that he's trying to counter the influence of these false prophets. And so he writes based on a visionary experience that he's had, this apocalyptic prophetic letter that presents himself as the one who is truly seen what is going on in heaven, that he is the one who has received a vision from Jesus Christ. He is the one who has stood in the heavenly throne room, who has had the curtain drawn back on space and time to see what it is that God is up to in human affairs. He is the one who authentically and authoritatively speaks with the word of the Lord to these 7 churches, trying to counter and dislodge the loyalty of these false prophets in those congregations. That's the first thing he's trying to do. Secondly, and most importantly, he's trying to secure loyalty to Jesus. As we've seen, the repeated issue that is confronting this people is, are they going to remain loyal to Christ in the face of persecution and suffering? Are they going to continue with their allegiance to Jesus exclusively when there's the alternative of also giving allegiance to Caesar the emperor? Recognizing, of course, that Caesar presented himself as the Lord of the universe, the Lord of all things, the King of the world. Christians would say, no, that is a title, that is a place that is only available to Jesus, God's Messiah. And so John is trying to secure radical loyalty to Jesus, even in the face of all of society's opposition and persecution. How is he going about achieving that loyalty is the final and most interesting thing about Revelation. Is that what John invites his audience to do through his apocalyptic prophetic vision is he invites the audience to draw the curtain back on the Roman Empire itself and see it for what it really is. As these 7 churches are tempted to compromise with the empire, to make their allegiance to Caesar as Lord as well as Jesus, just so that they can enjoy some kind of economic prosperity, John invites them to draw the curtain back on the Roman Empire and see who it really is that they are about to compromise with. Because when you look at it just in earthly terms, it just looks like your neighbours. It looks like the Roman state. It looks like flesh and blood kind of institutions that an individual is tempted to compromise with. And what's the big deal with that? Because Caesar's only a human being. We know that Jesus is God, so of course our allegiance to him trumps any supposed allegiance to Caesar. But what John is inviting is that the audience pull the curtain back on the Roman Empire and see the spiritual realities behind it. Because when you go up to heaven and you look down on the Roman Empire from God's perspective, you discover something very interesting, in fact, something very disturbing. That behind the physical manifestations of the Roman Empire, you find the forces of Antichrist. Indeed, the forces of that age-old enemy of God and his people, Satan himself. So when the churches might be tempted to compromise with the Roman Empire, they should realize that what they're really about to cozy up with are in fact the forces of Satan himself, the true enemy of God and his people. So let's then, just as we close, give a reading of a few parts of Revelation to see John going about that activity. I'd like us to read a few verses then out of Revelation chapter 17. So let me read these first 9 or 10 verses for you. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came to me and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And goes on down there in verse 9, it says, "This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other one has not yet come, but when he does, he must remain for a little while. So I'd like to ask you, how would a first century audience sitting in one of these 7 churches understand what has just been described here in Revelation 17? I think it's hard to deny the obvious, namely that they would have understood this as a reference to the Roman Empire. Let's have a look at the clues that they would have picked up on. First of all, he talks about the great prostitute who sits by many waters. One of the things which was a secret to Roman power was the fact that their naval strength enabled them to control the trade and sea routes across the Mediterranean. A second thing they would have piqued their interest was it says in verse 2 that with her the kings of the earth committed adultery. That the kings of the earth, the subject kings that were absorbed into the Roman Empire, gave their allegiance to the emperor in order to retain their grip on their own power and to prosper from their loyalty to the emperor. It says that the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries, that the bulk of the Roman population who's given their allegiance to Caesar is intoxicated by the adultery of that allegiance. It says the Spirit carried him off into a wilderness. He saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. And later on, that woman, it says, was dressed in purple and scarlet. These are colours uniquely associated with the Roman emperor. So much so that when a new emperor comes to the throne, one of the things that's used to describe that is that he has taken on the purple. And he goes on to describe glittering with gold, stones and pearls. The Roman emperor was the wealthiest man in the whole Roman Empire, and his family had amassed so much wealth that this would be an apt description of them. Goes on to say with the name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great. And as we mentioned last class when we talked about 1 Peter, Babylon was an early Christian reference to Rome, likening it to Babylon of the Old Testament, that pagan city which was the enemy of God and his people. It says the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people. This is written perhaps at a time in the 1st century where the Roman Empire, the state itself, has got engaged in the persecution and the execution of Christians. But I suppose the big giveaway is what John says in verse 9. He says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads of the beast that the woman rides are 7 hills. I don't know if you remember your ancient history, but the city of Rome itself was renowned for being built upon 7 hills. This is a clear reference to the Roman Empire, and it's communicating to John's audience that the Roman Empire that they're thinking of colluding and compromising with is Babylon the Great, is the source of all forms of prostitution. By that it's meant unfaithfulness to God and pagan idolatry, and that this beast, this tool of Satan is going to be used to persecute God's people and to execute those who are faithful in their testimony to Jesus. Therefore, these early churches should have nothing to do with flirting with giving allegiance to the Roman emperor or his empire. They should stay with their fervent, loyal and unique commitment to Jesus regardless of the cost. One other example I'd like to give of how the early church would have understood this as reference to the emperor is to come to the number of the beast, which is something I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In Revelation 13 verse 18, he says, this calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it's the number of a man, and that number is 666. That's an invitation to engage in a Jewish practice known as numerology, where letters of the Hebrew alphabet were ascribed a numerical value. And that when you convert the letters that make up a place name or a person's name in the scriptures and translate that into their numerical value, you might discover that numerical value has some form of symbolic significance. So when you take the name Nero Caesar and translate it into its Hebrew equivalent and then run it through what is called the gematria, this conversion of letters into numbers, what you discover is that name produces the number 666. It is a direct reference to the Roman emperor himself as the beast, the one in collusion with the Antichrist, in collusion with Satan himself. And as we read the end of Revelation, we discover that God is going to judge the beast. He's going to judge the Antichrist. He's going to throw Satan and his cohorts into the lake of fire. And God's people who have remained faithful in their allegiance to Jesus are going to be vindicated and saved and liberated into God's eschatological kingdom, which is going to ascend from heaven with peace and with glory and with healing. And that kingdom is going to be worth every bit of suffering that they experience as a result of their allegiance. So Revelation then is a prophetic apocalyptic letter in which John seeks to provide God's perspective on what these seven churches are experiencing them and challenge them to remain loyal to Christ and to deny compromising with the emperor and the Roman Empire and the imperial cult, because to go down that route is to compromise, in fact, with the forces of Satan himself. And that at the end of the day, those who remain loyal to Jesus will be rewarded with God's end-time kingdom and peace and life everlasting. It is a dramatic and it's a powerful letter that unveils to this first century audience what is really going on in the world around them and what God really sees and what God really thinks and what God has to say to them so that they can live lives of faithfulness to God in what must have been very trying and difficult circumstances. It's a powerful piece of work.